see, we didn't have like stone tablets you put on top of them. Yeah, we didn't care about safety. They're like, if the baby flies, we'll catch him. We'll catch him mid-air, you know what I mean? I mean, she's going back. They didn't have diapers back then, did they? They had the cloth ones, I know Dad.
I chose these. Look at it, because I went from all the way to
Yeah, so they had cloth and we had to wash them out. Man. Yeah, I bet you that was a big old bag. You had tied around all them towels. That was a big old bag. Yeah. That's good to have you on this bed today as well. Healthy. Yeah, we have all the technology. Now we got technology. Thank God I'm born in technology. Yeah, because our kids, it was great, man. We had everything. Diaper bed and all that good stuff. You know, diaper genie and bags and everything. Tag bag, no spell. You know, that's so thankful for that. So we're in Romans chapter number 2. So I gave you all the paperwork for my notes. I haven't printed or gave to you, but you do have them. And if you remember, we were talking about the excuses that Paul lays out that they give. You remember what the excuse was? You got your notes, Kelsey? Kelsey's got her notes. Well, it's in your notes, actually. Relative righteousness, right? Which is what?
It's the idea that, well, I'm not as bad as this person, so you know this is all right.
Right. So that's relative right. That I'm not as bad as my neighbor. I'm not as bad as the Jews. So God should let me in, right? That's kind of relative righteousness. We went over some things. Well, now we're talking about another excuse, and it's the extenuating circumstances as a Gentile, us as a Gentile. And we use this as an excuse. And Paul talks about it right here in Romans chapter 2. We'll look at verse number 12. We're on page, in the notes, we're on page 19. And by the way, I put page numbers at the bottom of the page, just so we can get it. Extenuating circumstances as a Gentile. Romans chapter 2, verse number 12 says this: For as many as have sinned without law shall also perish without law. And as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. Paul here is anticipating that after the relative righteous argument has been done away with, that man, particularly a Gentile, will use the excuse that the law was not for me. And it wasn't, right? The law wasn't for us. The law was for who? It was for the Jews. You remember Moses wrote what? The 10 Commandments. He put them on a tablet and brought them down there, and then he broke them because he got so ticked off and had to go back out there and do it again. You know what I mean? Deja vu. And so, so the excuse as a Gentile is, I didn't have the law. I don't need the law. There is no law, so God can't judge me by law. That's what they're saying. Paul is going to admit that the Gentiles didn't have the law given to them. Paul's going to explain that to you. He's going, yeah, I get it. You didn't have the law. But verse 12 does not say that those who sin without the law. I want you to look at verse 12. It says, for as many as have sinned without law shall also perish what? Without law. And as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. We are going to be judged regardless of the law without law. You know, you're going to be judged. God's going to judge you according to who you are. It doesn't matter. He's God. He can do that. Whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth. God doesn't need the law to judge a Gentile, by the way. Y'all know that, right? He don't need the law to judge a Gentile. Nor does God have to give Gentiles law in order for it to be fair. And I'll tell you why. Look at verse 13. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. For when the Gentiles which have not the law do, watch this, do by nature the things contained in the law, these, having not the law, are a law unto themselves. Now, now let me break that down for you. Let me just help you what Paul's saying right here. Paul says your own nature tells you what's right and wrong. Here you go. Run that red light this afternoon. You're not going to do that, are you?
No.
Why?
It's wrong.
Why?
It's against the law.
Why? See, right? That's a man-made law. Do you see that? Your nature tells you to do things right. Even, let me just go and say this, even a unjust, unmoral person, there's something in them that tells them they're supposed to do right. I don't care who they are. A murderer knows that murder is wrong. He does. Ted Bundy knew what was right and what was wrong. Can I go that far? He knew. People know because it's in them. But what happens is just because they know it don't mean they do it. We know what's right, but do you always do what's right? No. But Paul's saying this, your nature has some do and do nots planted in it. So God don't have to necessarily give you law for you to understand what's right and what's wrong. That's what he's saying in the verse. Let me read it for you. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but doers of the law shall be justified. For when the Gentiles which have not the law do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law are law unto themselves. I'll go further than this and say Jesus made us in the image of him. Didn't he? And Genesis said we were made in the likeness of God. Let us make man in our image and bring it to life. And so it is instilled in you to do what's right and do what's wrong. Yeah. Now there's some things you have to be taught. We know that. I mean, there's certain things you have to be taught. But there is some things in you by nature you know is wrong. Gentiles operate upon an accepted code of conduct which contains certain do's and don'ts. This code of conduct is what Gentiles have by nature. That's what I just told you, your code of conduct. In verse 15, we'll see that when God judges those Gentiles, he will judge them according to their own laws, which they have in them by nature. The only way that you cannot be judged by the laws is you got to live an upright and perfect life. And how many of you can do that? None of us. None of us. Romans 2:15 says this. Watch this. Which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness. Boy, that's very interesting. How many of you have listened to your conscience before? We thought we made that up. What's that, man? My conscience. Huh? Oh, that's right. I forgot about Jimmy the Cricket. He was, wasn't he? I forgot about that. That's what he was. That's right. Whose conscience was he? Pinocchio. Look at Paul. Man. Yeah, that's good. That's good too. He was Pinocchio's conscience. That's right. And Sue. I think of Star Wars, Darth Vader, Anakin Skywalker, and he said, "You were right. There was good in me."
Yeah.
And we said this, there's good in everyone. Why? Because you were made in the image of Christ. which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness. Watch this. And their thoughts demean while accusing or else excusing one another. Here's what he's saying. You are a violator of your own law. You're a violator of your own law. You ever heard of a double standard? Well, you know what a double standard is? Tell me what a double standard is.
It's kind of like if I say somebody looks superficial, that they probably judge things by their physical appearance. I just judge them by their physical appearance, by the way they look. That's a double standard. Say something and then do it yourself.
Right. So to be like, tell somebody not to do this and then I go ahead and do it. Right. I'll give you a great double standard. Here's what people do all the time. Now they'll tell their kids, now listen, you ought not to be smoking. Correct, and we do that. We do that. Do as I say, right? Not as I do. But you can't do that. That is not right. That is not how law works. Okay, that's not how law works. Just like dipping and all that. Let's not dip, but man, you really shouldn't. Because you know that. I mean, that's what. And that really struck home when I was trying to quit. Crystal was like, well, when we have our kids, you can't tell them not to do it, and you do it. Yes, I can. I'm the dad. She's like, but it's a double standard. She's like, well, why don't you just give them something? I was like, no, I can't do that. She goes, okay, then why should you be able to do it? Okay, I get it. You know, I mean, she was letting me have it. No, but it was a good conversation. But that's what I'm talking about. That's what he's talking about. He's saying their thoughts that meanwhile accusing or else she's one of them. The Gentiles' own laws do the very thing in their hearts. They are violators of their own laws. They respond to their own laws the same way that they would have responded to God's law. God says, God says, be faithful. He says, we'll break those laws. Right? So what you do with the laws that are by your nature, you would even do that to God's laws. You couldn't keep it. You can't keep it. That's really good. Romans 2:16 says this, in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. The secrets are the things that they think in their hearts and refuse to admit. That's those secret things. I should be doing this, but I'm not. God's told you to do this, but you're not doing it. God says, well, hang on. I'll judge you by that. The secret things. The secret things. In other words, the message to the Gentiles using this excuse is that a man's righteousness has to be as good as Jesus' righteousness. Which has to be perfect righteousness. And guess what? None of you in here got that today. That's the circumstance of the Gentile. Law's not for me. Law's not for me. Here's what people say. This is, and I think we said this last time, I'm not as bad as this guy. So I thank God to let me in. I've heard people say that. No. No. They're not gonna. Well, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. But I'm sure you've done some evil things. You know? And what about the guy that says, well, man, I've done good all my life? He's going to let me in. You see the Gentiles thinking? Well, what is good? You're comparing your good enough to what standard? Man standard. Yeah. Gentile standard. And Paul interrupts that and says, well, that's not even good enough. And you know what we do? We justify our actions by our own laws. We do. We do. What's the think, Bob?
It's just odd to me, like, you say that intrinsically we have something in us which wants to be lawful, but then there's something also within us that wants to be unlawful.
Correct.
Odd. Like, when those two come together, when you're about to make a decision whether to do right or do wrong, how do they interact, that nature,
Just the way you see them interacting today. They're confused. They're confused. That's why you need God. That's why you need Jesus living in your heart.
That's right.
Because a man left to his own self is, what was the Bible said, like full of troubles, and so it's a bad life. It's a bad life. Here's what Paul said. If you go and read Paul, you would think he was almost schizophrenic. And I believe it's in Romans, where he says, the things that I should do, I don't. Things I say I would do, I won't do. Things I don't want to do, I do. I would say that guy's a little schizo. He's a little bipolar. Do you want me to tell you what that is? That is actually his nature. You see? It's the do and the don'ts and the living for Christ, and the old man's still there. That's the Gentiles way of thinking. Now let's go to the circumstance as a Jew. Now watch this. This is the flip side of the coin. Paul gets into it. You're going to find that the Jew in the passage is admitting that God gave them his law, and we know that, right? God gave the Jews their law. But the reason he did so is because there was something different by nature in the Jew from the Gentiles. This is what the Jews think. And that was it was the whole reason that God brought the Jew near unto himself. They believed that they were somebody. They are. The Jews are God's chosen people. But let me say this, in the flesh, in the age of grace, they're just like me and you. They're just like me and you. They're sinners. I put a bullet note there. The Jew is going to wind up believing that God gave him the law, not for himself, because he had it all that by nature, but rather God gave Jews the law so that they could teach those blind Gentiles about the righteousness of God. Y'all remember the woman from Samaria when they were dealing with the Samaritan people, how the disciples was like, why would you even fool with a woman like that? Why would you even mess with a woman? Because they thought they were somebody. Matter of fact, if you remember, she called him, if I'm not mistaken, she called him Lord or Christ, and they said, how can she call you that? I think it was the one with the dogs even eat the crumbs, if I remember right. And she said, Lord, and she called him Lord, and the disciples were like, she don't have a right to call you that. Yes, she does. Yes, she does. But you see the Jews thinking? You see how they think? Because Christ coming to his own. It's very interesting about what Paul's doing right here. Galatians 2:15, let me show you, this is their nature. This is Paul. Okay, Galatians 2:15, I'm cutting a snippet out of it. But Paul is talking to the Jews of how they think. Watch what he says. We who are Jews by nature, now watch this, and not sinners of the what? That is a typical Jewish thing. Paul was a Jew, so he knew how they thought. That's the great thing about it. That's my love about Paul. Paul was a Jew, and God sent the Jew to go to the Gentile because he knew that not only could he win the Jew, he could win the Gentile. Because he knew how they thought. He knew their thinking process. Then in Romans 2:17, back to where we're at, he says this, behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God. Watch this. Paul says, you know what y'all are saying? I'm a Jew. Look at you. I'm a Jew. God ain't going to put his wrath on me.
That's right.
Matter of fact, he was going to set up his kingdom. You know we have that today. Let me show you something. Let me show you something. You ever people that try to fight for equal rights? You know where that all stems from? Jew and Gentile. Ain't it amazing? Everybody tries to fight, and I get it. I get it. We want to be equal across the board. I understand that. We want to be fair and just. But can you see the Jews doing the same thing right here? Let me say this. You have to say this very carefully. Be very careful not to be prejudiced against the soul of man. I didn't say race, I said the soul of man. Here's why I say that. There'll be people that'll never be as good as you are. There'll be people that'll never have what you have. There'll be people that won't have the clothes and won't look right and won't do right, but you ought not to turn them away because they don't meet your standards. You ought to take them in because they are a soul. They are who Jesus died for. Jesus died for them. And just because they don't have everything, and just because they're not wealthy and they're not successful, and be very careful when you cast that blame on them. We don't want those folks, or we don't want those kind of people. Be very careful with that because that might be the people Jesus wants. That might be. It really took me a long time to get that process because we look at monetary value. True story. True story. But I'll say this, Jesus went to the poor. Jesus went to the needy. Jesus went to the Gentile. He went to the dogs. Because he knew that they were in need of a Savior just like the Jews were in need of a Savior. Praise the Lord. But you see, the Jews are doing it back then. There's nothing new under the sun. Romans 2:18 says this. Now, I want you to watch what they do. They go on bragging. And Paul's telling the Jews right now what they're bragging about. Watch this. And knows his will. There's one. You need to underline that one. And approves the things that are more excellent. That's number 2. Being instructed out of the law, and are confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind. Number 3. A light of them which are in darkness, and an instructor of the foolish, and a teacher of babes, which hath the form of knowledge of the truth in the law. In verse 17, the Jews boast themselves of 8 particular things, and I just gave them to you. Number 1, they say, I'm a Jew. I'm better than you. Then they say, hey, we rest in the law. Y'all know what that means? That means they have peace with the law, do they? You know who crucified Christ? The Jews. You know who they set free? Barabbas, a murderer. But they rest in the law. They have peace with the law. Matter of fact, if you go back to the children of Israel when Moses had them, they would never like law. Matter of fact, there was many times when you look at that, they didn't want nobody to tell them what they ought to do. You can go through Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings and Judges, and you'll see that the Bible they would say, give us a king, or they'd say, give us a judge, and God would give them a judge, and they'd say, hey, we don't like him, get rid of him. And God would do that, and then they'd go back through some judgment, they'd be in captivity, and then they'd say, hey, give us a king. We want to take a king. God give them another king, and he'd turn everything around, start making things, and then they say, oh, we don't like this guy, we don't want this king. What do you want? What do you want? I mean, you can't have the cake and eat it too. That's what they want. Matter of fact, God gave them manna from heaven. They didn't like that either. I mean, I've never seen so many people. They get to, I mean, how crazy would it be? Let me just ask y'all a question. If God, every Sunday morning, we normally have donuts up here, but normally if every Sunday God dropped donuts down from heaven. Did you know? Would we? Some people would complain about it. Huh? Sure they would. They would never be satisfied. I mean, ain't that something somebody say? Donuts. I'll tell you, where's the bagels? Where's that leavened bread? You know what I'm talking about? I mean, blueberry very vague. You got to be very careful. Be very careful. The Jews said, hey, we got this, man. We have peace with the law. Then they said they know it's his will. They know it's the Lord's will. Do they? No, because they thought he was going to set his kingdom up when he walked the face of the earth. Matter of fact, he even asked Peter, he said, who do men say that I am? Well, some say thou art Jonah, some say thou art Elijah, some say thou art a prophet. He said, but who do you say that I am? He said, oh, that's easy. Thou art the Christ. He said, thou hast well said, Peter, for flesh and blood have not revealed this to you, but my Father which is in heaven. And then he goes on telling how he's going to be crucified. Now get it? Now they're bragging about knowing God's will. Goes to be crucified, and then what happens? Peter gets all ticked off. Oh Lord, that ain't happening on my watch. Yeah, I ain't like. And then he says, "Get thee behind me, Satan." I wonder if Peter said, "Who are you talking to?" You know how? What if the Lord told me that Kelsey come in and say, "Get thee behind me"? That's right. Kelsey say, "Me? I was just trying to help you, Lord." That's right. Well, I remember. That's right. Yeah. He called me Satan. Well, you got to remember what the battle is. The battle's not yours. It's the Lord's. And the Lord's got a bigger battle. But they don't know his will. Then he says, approvest of things more excellent. They said he ain't the Christ. He's a blasphemer. He ain't the Christ. He's a blasphemer. But I thought they know more excellent. I thought they know excellent things. Boy, we're getting something. Paul was going somewhere with this. I'm telling you, he was going somewhere with it. Then they said that they can guide the blind. Well, what about happened to the story of the Good Samaritan law? You know what I'm talking about? That's where it came back about the Good Samaritan. So the one that was in the ditch. You remember that? The priest walked by him, didn't help him. You know, all the religious rulers would go, but it was that Good Samaritan that took him out of the ditch and clothed him, gave him food and housed him, sent him to a house and left him there, and gave him to a good house to take care of him. He said, take care of him until I come back. You remember that? That's where the Good Samaritan law, where that came from. Well, they don't. Here's what we say. The blind leading the blind. They both fall into what? Ditch. You know where we got this stuff out of? The Bible. The blind leading the blind. The Jews were blind. Then they say, a light to them in darkness. Were they? An instructor of the foolish. We were the foolish. Just so y'all know, y'all are foolish. Y'all are Gentiles. Foolish. A teacher of babes. I love that. Let me break that down for you. That's exactly right. The Jews knew the law. The Gentiles didn't. They were babies. They didn't know anything. And you know what? The Jews think, they think they're okay with God right now. Yes, they do. Look at Romans 2, verse 21. I love Paul, man. Thou therefore which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? That's the question. Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? I love Paul, man. Thou saith a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Thou that makest the boast of the law, through breaking the law dishonoreth thou God. For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you. As it is written, for circumcision verily profiteth if thou keep the law, but if thou be a breaker of the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. Paul's saying that the Jews commit the same things as the Gentiles. As far as God's concerned, the law of Moses condemns the Jew of being a sinner just as it does the Gentile. Jewish law, you know you're a sinner. The Jews go through their sinner, they can't keep it. Paul, verses 25 through 29, I'll hit it next week. It goes about the whole idea by showing the Jews who will make his boast with God. You'll see Paul wants the Jew to understand that their flesh, just like me and you. How many of you know this, and you probably do because you're sitting here, I've told you this 100 times, that they still don't believe. They still don't believe. But I'll go further, there's Gentiles that don't believe. I can even go a little bit further. There's Christians who live like they don't believe. They live like they don't believe in God, who He is. We live in the age of grace, folks. We ought to be thankful that we can live and do what we want to do, but have the grace that God has given us to do what we can do without having to worry about keeping the law. I would be in trouble. Can I just go ahead and tell you? I'm going to be in trouble. We were talking at work the other day, and we was talking about some things, and we was going through some policies and doing. They was like, "Man, you probably can't keep none of these." I said, "Yeah, I could." They said, "Well, let me ask you this: what was on your report card when it come?" I said, "Well, if it made it wrong." I was like, "So we got to be very careful how we say that." And I was like, "If it never made it home, it was great." I was like, "Well, I can remember they used to have does not use time wisely." Huh? It's not a shocker, huh? Talks excessively. Not a shocker, either. There were several more. We won't get into those. But I couldn't keep those. Who wants to be quiet? You know what I'm saying? See, not even babies like to be quiet. He was speaking up. He was speaking up for me. I mean, who wants it? It would be very hard. If I had, I'll say this to you. If there was a real good secret that had a lot of good enticing stuff, I'd probably be able to keep it. I'll be wanting to tell. I'll be wanting to tell somebody. And then you know what we do when we do that, right? You know what we do when we do that. We say, "Now listen. Can't say anything. What I'm about to tell you, you cannot tell anybody else." They're like, "I promise." But the problem is, birds of a feather flock together. So the person I'm telling is like, "Yeah, go ahead. I promise I won't tell nobody." Yeah, I'm all ears, right? And then you tell them, and they're like, "I promise I won't tell nobody." Then they find their little friend. It's like, "Listen now. He told me this. You got to promise me." Y'all know, I mean, like, pinky swear promise, because I told them I wouldn't tell him, and I'm not. I'm just telling you. Okay, I haven't told anybody else, so I know if you say something that came from you, I didn't say anything. Come on, can I get a witness? You know? See, I'm speaking from experience, and y'all in agreement. That's what we're talking about. Paul's talking about those things. He says, "Hey man," and I don't want to get ahead of myself because he goes into it. But when you go back up to verse 1 of chapter 2, it says, "Therefore thou art inexcusable." Can I say this to you today? You are inexcusable. You're inexcusable. you can live right for the Lord. You can live faithfully for the Lord. You can do it. You are inexcusable. There's not one. You can't say, well, you don't understand my circumstance, because Paul says it's not about your circumstance. It's about who you serve. It's about who you serve. I'm working on something now. I was listening to a message this morning. I'm trying to work on something for Will's Revival that I preach on about Jacob. And y'all remember when Jacob wrestled with God? Y'all remember that story? He was in such desperation for a blessing that he would not let go of God. I mean, think about it. It was very interesting. He held on so God says, let go of it. I mean, this is God. Y'all got to understand what's going on right now. I mean, I kind of picture God saying, let go of me. Jacob said, matter of fact, I'm not letting go of you until you bless me. I am holding on. I'm not letting go. I'm not, bud, we're here to the end. That's the kind of service we need to have for the Lord. I'm not letting anything come to me. I'm not letting any excuse stop me from serving the Lord. I will serve. I will serve. I'm in a desperate need to serve. I'm not going to let it go. Why was the law given to us? It was to instruct us, not judge us. We're going to be judged according to His righteousness. His righteousness. Next week we'll get to verse 25 on down. And you'll see the final acts that man gives God about his desperation to be not judged. It's one last little, where man tries to, I challenge you, go home and read it. Go home and read it. It's very, let me just read it. Can I just read it to you before we get out of here? Because we still got, I just want you to listen to the language that Paul used. I'm just going to read it to you. I'm going to try not to say anything about it. Is this one good? I won't try it. That's Verse 26, therefore, if the uncircumcision keep the righteousness of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? And shall not uncircumcision, which is by nature, if it fulfill the law, judge thee, who by the letter of circumcision does transgress the law? For he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision, which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Jew, which is one inwardly, and circumcision is of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. I'm trying to say about that. I really can't do it. I'm not going to. Go study that little bit about the circumcision of the flesh and uncircumcision. Not what they do, but I get that. I'm talking about what he's talking about, a Jew and a Gentile right there. It's really good. Oh my gosh, I got to say something. All right, let's go to the Lord in prayer.